April 11th meeting of the City Finance Committee. And may I have a roll call, please?
Yes. Committee Member Alejandro Gutierrez
Here.
and Committee Chair Friedman.
Here. And Councilmember Harmon is going to be participating remotely today, but under the Brown Act procedures, those members present need to add to the agenda under the city's emergency procedures an item to vote on whether to allow Councilmember Harmon to participate remotely. So I will make that motion under the city's emergency procedures to allow Councilmember Harmon to participate remotely. Is there a second?
I second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Do we need a roll call on that?
Yes.
Okay, roll call.
Okay, roll call vote. Committee Member Alejandro Gutierrez
Yes.
and Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Okay, so thank you for that. So we are on to our regularly scheduled meeting. And so we now need to open up public comment. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak to any item not on today's agenda but under the purview of the Finance Committee? I'll start in the room here. I don't see anybody. Is there anybody online? Please raise your hand in the app.
Chair Friedman, there are no hands raised at this time.
So I will close general public comment. And we do have two items today, so I will start with the first item and turn it over to Ms. Doubles for the presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Friedman and committee members Gutierrez and Harmon. I am Laura Doubles. I'm the Housing and Human Services Manager for the city. Thank you for having us here today to present to you a request from our local partner, Transition House, for the city's loan forgiveness on their homeless families shelter, located at 434 East Ortega Street. I would like to recognize and thank Ms. Kathleen Boschke, the Executive Director of Transition House, for being present today as well for this request. Next slide. The next two slides shows staff's recommendation before you today for your consideration and recommendation to the City Council for approval. To summarize, the request is to forgive two city loans that were provided to Transition House for property located at 434 East Ortega Street that currently operates as a homeless family shelter. Approve an amended covenant to be recorded on the property to restart a new restricted 90-year term of continued use as a homeless family shelter. Next slide, please. Adopt a resolution of the council necessary to approve an increase in fiscal year 2023 expenditure appropriations in the Affordable Housing Fund for $460,000 to record the forgiveness of loans receivable, and authorize the Community Development Director to execute such documents as necessary, subject to approval as to form by the City Attorney. Next slide, please. Here's some important background information on the city's local housing partner, Transition House. They have very successfully provided homeless families shelter in Santa Barbara since 1984. Every year, they serve approximately 200 families, 150 which are actually homeless, while the other 50 are at risk of homelessness. In 1992 and 93, the city provided two loans to help establish the shelter, each with 30-year residual receipt repayment terms, where a payment is made only when the net cash flow of the property is positive, which is very commonly used in affordable housing developments in order to make them financially feasible. Next slide, please. Transition House is the borrower of these two loans. And back in the early 1990s, the city recognized the great need for establishing a shelter to provide homeless families a place to go in order for them to avoid living on the streets. In 1992, the city provided a loan for this effort from its Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG funds, in the amount of $245,000. And in 1993, the city added another loan in the amount of $460,000 from its redevelopment agency funds to help establish the shelter. In doing so, the city acknowledged the need to support the shelter and its provision of services as a public benefit. Next slide, please. And here is a current picture of the shelter as it is today, an attractive and well-maintained and sustained property embraced by the neighborhood. Next slide, please. As intended at the establishment by the former council, the shelter does not charge any rents or fees for services. This causes the shelter to have a no permanent ongoing source of funding to recognize positive cash flow every year needed for possible debt service. The only funding the shelter receives comes from extensive efforts every year by Transition House staff in securing federal and state grants, or revenue from fundraising events and charitable contributions. In 1999, Council acknowledged this financial dilemma and stopped any additional interest from accruing on the loans in order to avoid further indebting the property by setting the interest rates to 0%. In 2004, the County of Santa Barbara followed and also acknowledged the financial distress and forgave their original $190,000 loan that they had provided originally to help establish a shelter as well, recognizing the great public benefit the shelter provides to the community. Next slide, please. When city staff presented the project to council back in 1992, it was shared at that time that the cash flow of the shelter may not ever be enough to provide debt service for the city's loans. City staff stated in their staff report then that there could be a scenario in which at the end of 10 years, the project does not have a positive cash flow. Typically, in affordable housing developments, positive cash flow is often finally realized after a 10-year period once an initial development costs may be covered and can oftentimes allow debt repayments at that point. However, in this situation, staff informed council right up front that this may not occur in this project as it was an exception by being a homeless shelter with no rents or fees charged. In order to try to avoid this from occurring, the council placed a requirement on Transition House at that time to conduct a campaign, a capital campaign, to raise $500,000 and place it in an investment account so that it would cover the repayment of the loans. However, the council failed to indicate when that repayment of the loans was to occur once it had been raised. Next slide, please. So in 1999, an opportunity arose for Transition House to possibly develop more transitional housing units on other properties that they owned. So they returned to the council and proposed using the $500,000 instead to provide the community with 14 new transitional housing units. The council approved their request. Transition House successfully developed those new units, and through the process, the council dropped the investment account requirement as the funding was then used to provide for the new transitional housing units. The inference at that point was since the funding was approved by the council for developing the transitional housing units instead, that it basically may void the requirement to pay back the loans since the secured funding in that investment account would no longer be available and the shelter's financial picture would most likely remain the same. Next slide, please. This slide shows a table of the city loans that have been provided and their current status. The total of both loans with accrued interest to 1999 when the council set the interest rates to 0% is $763,242.20, with a breakdown of that being $705,000 of principal and $58,242.20 in accrued interest. Next slide, please. The goal of the shelter's finances each year is basically to cover all of its expenses. Without an ongoing permanent source of funding, each year-end cash balance position differs, mostly small deficits covered by years with small surpluses. If there is any surplus, though, that is actually realized, it is used for accomplishing needed repairs and maintenance to the shelter. Next slide, please. In exchange for the loan forgiveness, Transition House is offering to restart the city's affordability period for a new 90 years, which adds 50 years to the current covenant and shelter use for homeless families. The covenant will restrict the property to be used solely for a shelter for the purposes of transitional housing and related services. Next slide, please. In summary, back in 1992, the council recognized the need for a homeless family shelter, and that need very much remains today. The city provided the two loans in order to help establish a shelter, fully supporting the concept of providing this vital public service to our community. In 1999, council approved a proposal from Transition House to use the investment account that was to pay back the loans instead for development of 14 new transitional housing units, recognizing the great need and benefit to the community. In doing so, the council released the requirement to maintain the funding in an investment account for repayment of the loans, and there is no charge of rent or fees for services at the shelter, and there never has been, in order to serve one of the hardest hit populations in our community, homeless families. I commend Transition House for not only providing this invaluable service to our community for well over 30 years, but for keeping the shelter and property well maintained, attractive, and reputable all along. They are also to be commended for their enormous efforts in raising the funds for this shelter's operations every year to ensure it remains a public asset and benefit to our community. The city's support has been vital to this shelter and is very much needed to sustain its operations and the public service it provides. Next slide, please. And with that, we are back to the staff recommendation slides regarding the request put forward to you today for consideration of loan forgiveness. And that concludes my presentation, and I, as well as Ms. Boschke, are here for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Doubles. Just for procedures for today, since we do have a member that's remote, I'll start in chambers here for questions and comments, and then I'll go online, just so everyone knows how to expect how the flow will go. So I'll turn it over if there's any questions from my colleague in chambers. No questions here. Are there any questions from Member Harmon?
No, Chair, thank you.
And I don't have any questions either. So at this point, I will open it up to public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? Not seeing any in the room. Are there any members online who wish to speak to this item?
Chair Friedman, there are no hands raised.
Okay, I will close public comment. And then I do need comments and motions, so I'll open it up to my colleague, Member Gutierrez.
I wanted to make a motion to move staff recommendation.
All right, the motion's been made, and is there a second?
Second.
And any comments from any of my colleagues? All right. I will just say I appreciate all the work that Transition House does for our community, and this is in keeping with the county. They forgave the loan, and this allows you to continue to do that great work rather than to have to worry about this being on the books. So it makes sense, and it will ultimately benefit all the people who use Transition House services as well as the organization, so I'm happy to support this. With that, we do need roll call for today's vote, so may I get a roll call for the motion of staff recommendation?
Yes, motion was made by Committee Member Gutierrez, seconded by Committee Member Harmon. We'll start with Committee Member Gutierrez.
Yes.
Committee Member Harmon.
Yes.
Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
That motion passes unanimously.
Great. Thank you for that item. I'll close this item, and we will move on to item 2, which is the proposed updates to the solid waste rates. And I'll turn it over to staff.
Good afternoon, Chair Friedman and Council Members Gutierrez and Harmon. I'm Dustin Murbach with City Environmental
Could
Services.
you hold on one moment?
Sure.
Is the audio picking up?
Is it picking up?
I think you might need to get the
With that-
microphone a
there
little
we
higher.
go. Get a little higher. There we go. All right. A little too tall. All right.
I know the feeling.
All right. So, starting over, good afternoon, Chair Friedman, council members, committee members, Gutierrez and Harmon. I'm Dustin Murbach with Environmental Services, Senior Environmental Specialist. And today I'm here to present on the proposed solid waste rates for fiscal year 2024. Slide, please. Yes. And so we are going to be discussing exclusively the rate increase for the solid waste rates. Water and wastewater had their rate approvals for fiscal year 24 in a multi-year approval process previously. Looking at the total bill impact that does include water and wastewater, the typical residential customer will see a 2.4% increase. Looking at the overall solid waste rate revenue requirement, we are looking at a 3.4% increase for fiscal year 24. Next slide, please. So what we will talk about today is the components that go into how these rates were developed and built. Those factors include the elements that are affecting the revenue and service stability, the components of those revenue requirements, and what those final solid waste rates end up looking like. Next slide, please. Our solid waste rate fund is $39 million. Of that, 90% is associated with long-term contracts. That's our franchise agreement with Marburg. That is our material delivery agreement with the county, et cetera. And so in order to achieve our city reserves policies, we need to have a policy reserve of 25% of that. We'll get into a little bit more in that in a subsequent slide. And then there are also the need for us to raise money for specific changing system and service needs. That's partly going to include how we are going to move forward with our new franchise agreement with Marburg that is going to be adopted, we expect to be adopted by council soon, as well as various requirements for making sure that we have enhanced clean service options for the city, as well as any additional regulatory requirements that we need to be funding. Next slide, please. So the collection services are proposed. We have a new franchise agreement that we're looking forward to have effective July 1st, 2023, if approved by council. Under that proposed new agreement, the hauler's overall compensation will increase by 5.2%. Moving on to the next slide, we'll get into some detail on that. One of the components here is that we are moving towards a franchise fee model for receiving the funds that need to go to the general fund in order to maintain our system, our city systems that are related to the use of the solid waste services, things that can go towards street repairs for the heavy trucks, that sort of thing. Currently, we are using a utility user tax, UUT, on solid waste services. That's unusual and not really a best practice in California, and we are moving away from that by moving into a franchise fee that is paid by the franchise holder, and discontinuing that user utility tax. And so the elimination of that will, again, be offset by the revenue from the franchise fee to maintain that level of funding that is going to the general fund. Next slide, please. We also have one of the major components of our rates is the processing disposal. This is the material delivery agreement with the county for recycling and organics processing and disposal. That agreement will expire December of 2038. And as you can see, our disposal costs on per ton of any municipal solid waste, and this applies to whether it is trash, recycling, or green, exclusive of green waste, but our organics material, our yellow bin program that you may see our commercial customers use, we pay that amount that increases year over year. You can see that it's a fairly large jump, particularly from 2019 to 2020, but that is tapering off as the system has gone into effect, and the increases are more closely tied to inflation and regular program management costs. So we're seeing about a 3.5% increase this year, from $170 a ton to $176 a ton. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the city reserves policy calls for maintaining a 25% reserve. And so based on that $39 million total budget, we would be required to have $9.75 million in reserves. So what that means is that when we have our rates, that overall total budget increase year over year, we need to slightly increase our reserve amount year over year, and that gets embedded in the rates as a component as well, which will help keep things in line with the increased program costs. Next slide, please. The system improvements that I mentioned include compliance with Senate Bill 1383, which requires the mandatory organics collection and edible food recovery, various programs that we have to support that. as well as new and enhanced solid waste collection services, which see to things that keep our community clean, litter, abandoned waste cleanups, encampment cleanups, as well as what we are moving towards with our new agreement with Marburg to enhance the options for bulky item pickup services and household hazardous waste events. Next slide, please. So what we see here is the overall impact of the change in the rate increases per our contracts and program revenue requirements, combined with the discontinuation of the utility users tax. And so what we see is that with the overall compensation to Marburg increasing by 5.2%, the 3.1% increase for the tipping fees under our material delivery agreement with the county, and then a 1.6% increase in city programs, the nominal increase of the rates is 9.9%. But because we are discontinuing the user utility tax, which is typically presented on the bill, calculated after the rates, the published rates, the discontinuation will reduce the rates that the customers see on their very final bill, rates and user utility tax included. That will drop it by 6.5% to make the total change to overall customer charges be an increase of 3.4% for fiscal year 24. Next slide, please. And so what we see here is every year we present how that will look on a customer's bill, what they will see. There's a slight difference this year in that we are including in the third column of current cost the rate and the user utility tax. And so we can see that for the 1 unit small residential customer, it will be going from $61.16 under the fiscal year 23 rates to $59.82 inclusive of everything, which is actually a negative 2% change in the customer bill. Similarly, we have the 2 to 4 unit small residential customers. Their bill is going from 108 down to 106, that same 2%. What we see in the large residential, which serves 5 or more multifamily units, is that we are seeing an 8.7% increase. And if we go to the next slide, that slide represented for one of the smaller large residentials with cart and can service. What we are seeing in the larger smaller medium dumpster service, large residential customers, is that same 8.7%. For the small business or dumpster service business, we see a 2.2% increase. Now note that there is that higher level increase in the large residential sector, that 8.7%, because when we are incorporating the franchise fee, rather than it going from how it was calculated previously, there is a set amount that is being collected in the rates to make Marburg whole, and then we are receiving our, and then Marburg is paying the out of their compensation for that. And so the amount that we need to be collecting for the total overall franchise fee is being distributed among the 3 sectors: the small residential, the large residential, and the business. Now, that amount is being distributed based on the cost to service each of those sectors. And because while the large residential is the smallest proportional cost, it is also the smallest number of accounts. So it is the amount of money that is being applied to the large residential sector is proportionally appears higher, which is why you get that larger percentage increase there. And these are monthly bills. Next slide, please. What we have here is a comparison of solid waste bills for single-family customers. These are the FY23 rates, as the other jurisdictions do not have their FY24 rates posted yet. And you can see that City of Santa Barbara at about $58 is lower than in Hope Ranch, higher than in Goleta, but that we have sort of a range in the region from a little under $40 to about $64. And so the City of Santa Barbara is in that range at about $58 a month. Next slide, please. And what we will see here is the overall impact of what a customer sees on their final utility bill from the city that includes the costs of the water and wastewater. And so for this typical single-family residence that uses 900 cubic feet of water and has 65 gallons of trash recycling and green waste service per week, that the bill will be going from $251 to $257, which is going to be a $6 difference, or about 2.4% increase from fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 24. Partly due to, as you can see, that user utility tax dropping off and being embodied in the solid waste rates. There will continue to be that 6% user utility tax in the water billing. It does not apply to the wastewater billing. Next slide, please. And so we wish to bring forward the recommendations that Finance Committee A receive a presentation on proposed solid waste rates for fiscal year 2024. B, set a public hearing date for June 6th, 2023 at 2 p.m. for consideration of changes to the city's solid waste rates. And C, direct staff to send a notice of public hearing to customers informing them of the public hearing and proposed changes to solid waste rates. And those two elements are for compliance with our Prop 218 noticing. Yes, and I will also point out that in the CAR received that we had originally had that posted for June 13th. That has moved forward to June 6th to meet some calendaring needs of council. And we open the floor for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ruback. Are there any questions from Member Gutierrez?
Yes. Why doesn't it, the UUT apply for the water? Can you explain? And yes, for solid? Why are we still using the user utility tax for water rates, but not for waste?
My understanding, not being a water specialist, is that the utility user tax is a fairly standard. The distinction being that for solid waste, we have a franchise agreement. There's a third party that is providing those services, and they are using city resources. They are driving on our streets with industrial trucks that are relatively high impact, and so there are costs incurred by the city for access to those right-of-ways and for the wear and tear on those streets, that sort of thing, that we are capturing, that we are essentially requiring the hauler to pay for. Whereas the user utility tax is being applied to water because that is an internal city-provided service that doesn't have that same sort of right-of-way consideration. Furthermore, it is also a much more volumetric service that can be the customers are, you use less water, your bill goes down more. That doesn't maintain that same level of parity with how a subscription to a solid waste service operates.
And just for clarification, when our rates go up, also the amount of reserves, the amount of money that wastewater has to put, solid waste has to put into the reserve also increases?
That is correct,
Okay.
to align with city policy.
What is the rate now for 2023 on the customer charge? Because I know there for 2024, it indicates there's going to be a total charge of 3.4%. It's on slide 10.
Slide 10.
Be just 1 second so we can pull up the slide. Go ahead.
Please repeat the question.
So you had mentioned that 3.4% is going to be the change to customer charge for 2024?
Yes.
And so my question is, what's the charge now for 2023?
So that is us going from our current total revenue requirements
Okay.
of approximately $36 million going up to that $39 million required in for FY24.
Okay. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Harmon. Any questions?
Excuse me, none for me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Ruback. You answered my question about that I had about why the multifamily residential was seeing an increase where others were either a decrease or below the 3.4. So then my only other question I have is in terms of how are we communicating both to the public for the noticing and as well as with the media on it is a 9.9% rate increase of the rates, but the utility user tax decrease, so that So that is what we're trying to convey, is that the overall increase is only 3.4%, not 9.9. How are we engaging with the media and the public on that?
That is correct. We do have the Prop 218 notice that will be that is scheduled to be mailed out on April 21st. That will have an entire section that describes that change in moving from a rates plus UUT to a rates inclusive of the funds that Marburg requires that eliminate the UUT. And so that should be received by every single account holder per our Prop 218 noticing process, as well as we do a courtesy emailing to every customer account holder who has an email address on file with our billing system. And I'm sure that our outreach staff will make sure to do appropriate media notifications as well.
And on the Prop 218 notice, it'll clearly show for the public that there is a change in the elimination of the utility users, so that the overall increase is the 3.4%, not the 9.9.
Absolutely. For regulatory compliance purposes, it will say 9.9, but then there's a clarification that the final bill seen by the customers will be a 3.4% increase for overall revenue requirements.
Great. Thank you. A follow-up question from Member Gutierrez.
This question is for Mr. DeMartini. What is the impact on this increase on solid waste to our reserves for the city? It's a positive, it's a negative. Can you explain to the public, please?
Sure, be happy to, Councilmember Gutierrez. So first, it's important to clarify that the solid waste is an enterprise fund. So they operate completely independent of the city's general fund. The general fund does not subsidize the solid waste enterprise in any way, shape, or form. So as Mr. Marbeck said earlier, that the revenue requirement for this rating for next fiscal year is to raise rates by an effective amount of 3.4%. Because the annual operating expenses go up every year, right? And the city council reserve policy is a percent target of 25%. It's important that the reserve amount actually goes up proportionally as well. So the net effect of this action will be to increase reserves proportionally so that we can achieve the 25% reserve policy target.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Ruback. And so at this point, I will open up to public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? Not seeing any in the room, I'll turn it to, are there any members online? Please raise your hand in the app.
Chair Friedman, there are no hands raised.
Okay, I will turn it back over. Is there a motion to approve the staff recommendation?
I motion to approve staff recommendation.
Is there a second?
A second.
Great, and I just want to thank our staff for putting this all together and for the proper noticing that's coming up. And it is a little bit tricky this year, but ultimately I think it's a good change that goes in line with best practices. We're out of the best practices with the utility user tax, but this will also ensure we have proper reserves and proper funding going forward. And so with that, may I have a roll call, please?
Yes, motion was made by Committee Member Gutierrez, seconded by Committee Member Harmon. We'll start with Committee Member Gutierrez,
Yes.
Committee Member Harmon,
Yes.
and Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
That motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, everyone. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.